Today we will be going over how to write rate expressions. First, let's go over some rules for writing the rate equation. The first rule is that any inputs should be positive. Simply put, if the tip of the arrow is pointing at the letter, that's an input and it is going to be positive or added to the equation. Rule 2, any outputs should be negative. If the arrow is pointing out of the letter and towards something else, that value is negative or subtracted from the equation. Third, a zero order will be indicated by a capital letter. These capital letters stand alone and will not be multiplied by anything. Lastly, a first order will be indicated by a lowercase letter. When you see this lowercase letter, it will signal you to multiply that by the driving species, which is at the blunt end of the arrow or where the arrow is coming out of. Let's go over some of these rules. In an example problem, I will show you how we use them. So you begin by writing the rate equations for each letter A, B, and C. Let's start with A. So the first thing I want to point out is that in this rate equation, you can see that there are these lowercase letters and these capital letters. The lowercase letters indicate that it's a first order reaction like we mentioned. So this means when you see a lowercase letter, you're going to have to multiply it by the driving species. The driving species will be at the blunt end of the arrow. So using this as an example, that driving species would be A. You can see from the blunt end pointing out. Over here, you can see a capital letter. This means that it is a zero order equation. When you see a capital letter, you will not have to multiply by anything. Lastly, let's go over what an input and an output is. An input is anything that has the tip of the arrow coming towards it. So we can see that this would be considered an input, and over here, this would be considered an input for the letter A. Anything that the tip of the arrow is pointing towards is going to be an input. If you see the blunt end of the arrow, this is going to indicate an output. Our rules for inputs are that they are positive, and for outputs, they are negative. Let's go ahead and work on this letter A. The first thing I like to do is start with all of my inputs. So here is an example of one input pointing towards the letter A. We can see that this input is K1, and the letter is lowercase. That indicates that it's a first order reaction and we will have to multiply by the driving species at the blunt end of the arrow, which in this case is C. Because we're working on an input, this value is going to be positive. And since it is a first order, we're going to multiply these together. So let's go ahead and write that C times lowercase k1. Now let's look to see if we have any other inputs. Here, we can see that one is here because the tip of the arrow is pointing at that A. So let's look at that input. It is a lowercase k3. Since that letter is lowercase, we need to multiply it by the driving species at the blunt end of the arrow, which is the letter B. Let's go ahead and write that in our rate equation. So it's an input, so I'm going to add it. B times K3. Since we have finished our inputs here, let's begin to work on our outputs. Here, the output is lowercase k2. So we are going to have to multiply that by the driving species, which in this case is A. Because we're working on an output, this will be a negative value. And since it is first order indicated by that lowercase letter, we're going to multiply them. Let's move on to our next output. Here, we can see that it is a capital K. So that indicates that it's a zero order reaction and we will not multiply by the driving species. When you see this capital letter, the value is going to stand alone. Since it is an output, we are going to subtract it from our rate equation. Since we have made sure that we included all of our inputs and our outputs, we have finished with the letter A. Let's move on to the next letter, B. First, let's tackle the inputs. We can tell that it's an input with that tip of the arrow pointing at our letter. Again, it is that K, capital K01. Because the letter is capital, it stands alone. And because it is an input, it is a positive value. There are no other inputs for this letter, so let's move on to our output. Again, that's going to be anywhere the arrow is pointing out of, and all of the outputs are negative. In this case, the output is lowercase k, so that means we have to multiply it by the driving species, since the letter is lowercase. For this case, the driving species is going to be b, so we're going to subtract b times lowercase k3. Oops, sorry. Since we made sure that we got all of our inputs and our outputs, we can move on to the last letter, C. As you can see, there is no arrow coming into this letter, so there are no inputs for this equation. Let's check if we have an output, and we do because this arrow is pointing out of the C. Our output for this one is lowercase k1. Because this value is lowercase, we're going to multiply by that driving species, and you can see from the blunt end of the arrow, that's C. So again, it's an output, so we're going to subtract this value. And that is going to be minus C times lowercase k1. Since we hit all of our inputs and our outputs, we are also finished with this letter. And hopefully this example problem has helped you understand how to write a rate expression. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, let me know.